Hello friends, welcome to Experience Data Talk, a show featuring data science leaders and technologists from around the world. This is episode number 104, and today we get a chance to learn from Sherrell Dorsey. Sherrell is a data journalist, a social entrepreneur, and passionate advocate for improving diversity and inclusion in our tech space. Sherrell started coding when she was 14 years old at the Technology Access Foundation in Seattle, and she later spent her summers in high school as an intern at Microsoft, learning how to manage labs and build software. She later founded BLKTECH Interactive and ThePLUG, which we'll get into later in the show. She's a gifted writer, and she earned her master's degree in data journalism from Columbia University. And after talking with her, I was so moved that I started to jot down some notes about kind of the best ways to introduce her. And I just want to read to you some of the words that I wrote down to kind of help explain who Sherrell is. So I wrote down in my journal, Sherrell is an entrepreneur, a mover and shaker, a clear leader, a critical thinker, a doer, an instigator in all the best ways. She's a motivator. She doesn't settle. She is humble. She is caring. She's an innovator. She is fired up. She's highly intelligent, compassionate, empathetic, assertive, a protector, confident, and she gets things done. And that's just the beginning of some of the words I wrote down to explain who she is. I loved chatting with her. I hope to have her back on the show in the future. In today's episode, we chat with her a little bit about her background, what got her started working in data science technology, how she balanced her love of technology and also art, what it was like interning at Microsoft when she was so young. We talk about what led her to launch ThePLUG, as well as BLKTECH Interactive and the work that she's doing in Charlotte. And you'll notice in today's show that one of the common threads is around how inclusion drives innovation. And we talk about different ways that we all can do a better job, not only celebrating diversity, but also caring for all of those around us, both in what we say and also what we do. I hope you enjoyed today's show. I certainly did. Let's get to it. I was going through Twitter and somebody retweeted you, and I saw your profile and I clicked over. And the moment I read your Twitter bio, I was like, I need to have her on Data Talk. Your Twitter bio said, data journalist raised on MS-DOS and Tupac. Yes. And I love that because I'm a huge fan of data science and I love hip hop. And so when I read that, I'm like, I need to learn more about what Sherrell's doing.
Yes, I love it.
So tell me about how you got started in technology.
Yeah, it's such an interesting kind of storyline. So I'm from Seattle originally. So obviously just kind of being surrounded with a very interesting tech and kind of hipster, hippie community growing up, just a ton of different access points to technology, especially growing up as a kid of the 90s, CD-ROMs, AOL, sort of the birth of the internet really shaping my experience at home. My grandfather purchased personal computers for me and my cousins. And from there, it was like candy, right? And so when I say I was raised on MS-DOS and Tupac, like it was a very real thing. It was like, Z was definitely just as celebrated as like the life and career of Tupac. And so I really just got started early on, basic word processing, working on homework. Because I actually recall the days of writing on a typewriter at my uncle's home.
Yes.
So when the personal computer became a thing, it was like plugging in my floppy disk, really making that transition of doing all of my homework via computer, using AOL to communicate with my friends. And then when AIM was like that birthplace, that becoming like a whole new plugin. And I'd always been very entrepreneurial. So whether I was like spearheading a bake sale or a yard sale, I was creating and crafting eventually in Publisher when Windows 97 came out, and creating flyers and helping, my mom and some of the things she was doing for like some of the boards that she sat on, helping them to design materials, or creating business cards for myself when I would like create and make jewelry and sell them to all my mom's friends at work. And so,
oh, how cool.
So technology was always embedded. And then because of that affinity for the technology, my mom came across a program called the Technology Access Foundation that was spearheaded and developed by retired Microsoft software engineer named Trish Malines DeZico, who was kind of one of the only Black women software engineers in the space at that time. And it just really diagnosed early on that, listen, like there's not many folks who look like me, come from the same backgrounds that I come from, working out here in Redmond, Washington on the Microsoft campus. I want to ensure that kids of color, inner city kids get access to the skills that will get them into this space. And so she ended up converting a storefront into a computer training site. And so my mom somehow stumbled upon the information. It might have been just a flyer or maybe a news article that she read. And she's like, you should be a part of this program. So in 2001, when I entered high school, I would go after school 2 days a week to the Technology Access Foundation. And at the time I was participating in a program called the Technical Teams Internship Program. And so we would train in a programming language. The first year was just like basic computer knowledge, taking apart computers, putting them back together, understanding all the components, how they worked, doing basic web development in HTML. And then we would move on to things like JavaScript, CSS, ASP.NET. I eventually, I really loved like my network administration classes. And so we got to do that. So year after year, we got to decide on what track we wanted to take. And each summer we could complete an internship. And so I interviewed and got hired at Microsoft, and I worked on several teams over the summer. And then every year that we actually completed our internship, as well as the program at TAF, the shorthand for Technology Access Foundation, we would get money for college. And so it was a complete win-win. Free program. It was very fortuitous to be in Seattle at the time that I was, to have a mom who did not understand technology, to that extreme, but knew that this was going to be an opportunity to introduce me, number one, to skills that would prepare me for college, and then also skills that would help me in the workforce. And so that was my introduction, and I got to really supercharge that through this program that I fortunately had access to. And so it's interesting to be where I am today, especially, working in technology, because, traditionally that track is, go into CS automatically. And I really took a very different route. I went to the Fashion Institute of Technology because I also had sort of this artistic side to me and this business side to me and this entrepreneurial side. And I was trying to figure out, how do I merge all those fields together? But that was really my journey, and it drastically prepared me for the technology industry. So at 14, 15 years old, like going to work at Microsoft, having my own office, having a team to work with of adults, like, of course it was very intimidating because you're like, I don't know how to drive, and like I'm working. Yeah. And so it was a cool experience. Like before tablets were a thing, like I got to have a tablet. Like I got to work with the first tablet before like Windows XP had launched. Like I was kind of in the background listening to, the teams that were building it. And so it was just a really interesting, eye-opening and hands-on experience of like creating things out of thin air. And then also like bringing just projects into fruition. So that's my tech journey.
I think that it was so cool that your mom like saw this opportunity and was like, noticing your skills and your gifts, was like, you would do really well in this organization that will be able to help build you up with these other technical skills. Did you find, like during that time, were there any classes that was like, cause I know how kids are sometimes, like I look at my kids and I'll find something like, this will be good for you. And then my kids will do it and like, no, this is not, I'm not really happy here. Were there any moments along this journey early on where you were like, Mom, this is really not, I'm not cut out for this, or I'm not interested in that?
Absolutely. I remember, distinctively remember having a conversation. I think my mom had picked me up from TAF one day, and it wasn't that I wasn't enjoying it. I just had always had this artistic side to me. So while I was going to TAF maybe Tuesdays and Thursdays, on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I was actually in dance class. Like I wanted to, like, I was performing at like local theaters.
Oh, wow.
Dancing. I had eventually got a chance to work with Savion Glover. And so there was a strict like demarcation of, you're either an artist or you're a technologist. And their worlds at the time were not converging whatsoever. And so it was like, I was in the studio on the days I was not in the computer lab. And so it was really rough to decide, especially at such a young age, how that was all going to play out. And so I remember having a conversation with my mom because I knew of some folks who had decided not to complete the TAF program. And I was like, I don't know if I'm going to continue this. Like, I kind of want to put more time into dance, because I saw, dance is one of those things where it's like the more time you put into it, obviously the better you get, and anything. But particularly when it comes to like coordination and just improving, as an artist, and I felt like I could not dedicate enough time to it. And so, my mom was really good. It's funny when I retell this story to her, because she was like, "Oh, I wasn't going to let you quit. I just wanted you to like go through the thinking process of what you would be giving up." And so she kind of listened to me and my concerns, and she's like, maybe what you should really do is kind of, think about like what's important to you. Like, just do your best, like carve out more time, like spend more time with better time management, and like, don't think about the opportunities that you potentially could be giving up. And so her helping me through that critical thinking process, I'm really glad that I stayed, because I do see friends that did not complete, and I see kind of how lost they were, particularly in college and then sort of post-college, and really having some skill sets that they could hold on to. Because even though I decided not to go into computer science, I still stuck with technology in some way or frame, and it helped me tremendously. Like when I was doing internships and I had to help like fix code on the back end of a website, or, WordPress was starting to proliferate, and I could go in and manipulate things and get things moving, or be able to instruct my employers on here's how something works. I saw that like if I had not had that foundation, it would have not made me as competitive, in the workforce. In addition to being able to launch some of my own personal like entrepreneurial endeavors that I did in college, like I ran a PR newswire site. Where I would charge people to send press releases to the press. And like, that's kind of how I paid my rent for a semester. And so for me, it was definitely, I could have taken a completely different route and then I would have been here today. But I'm really glad that that my mom gave me the freedom, and she gave me the freedom. And again, tech was not her thing, but she was just like, this is such a great opportunity. You don't want to give that up, but really think about like what would you be trading in if you did not complete this program? How does that, drastically change your life and your possibilities? So that was really, really interesting to tell and to walk through with a 15-year-old, who wanted to dance on Broadway. And so, so that was interesting.
What advice would you give to parents who maybe they see similar programs or classes at a local college that to help their kids on a certain subject, and maybe those parents just need some encouragement and just kind of in that similar spot that maybe your mom was in? Like they see this opportunity that maybe my kids would thrive in this, but not sure if I should do this or not.
I think there's a couple of different things. I'm not a parent myself, but I do know what it feels like to see yourself represented in a space. And I think sometimes there's an underlining question that we're not asking kids about why they don't want to do something. I think it's not like just pure laziness or I'm not interested. Sometimes it is I haven't made any friends, or it's awkward, or it's uncomfortable. I was fortunate that my acclimation into tech started with people that looked like me in a community that looked like me. And so when I got to the Microsoft campus, though there weren't a lot of folks that looked like me, the central core of some of the programming that was established for my particular internship program, it helped put me in touch with people from all backgrounds. So I was kind of with a cohort of other interns from other schools and other, incomes, family backgrounds, nationalities, what have you. And then I also was able to have mentors who also were people that did look like me. And so that for me made all of it less intimidating. And it helped me to see like, hey, I can build friendships wherever, but then also on those core spaces where I did need another Black woman to kind of show me like, oh, here's kind of a path, and to have some very honest conversations with me. It helped me to feel much more comfortable and confident in saying, oh, I can do this as well. And so sometimes it's less about just the activity itself and more so of, is this a multicultural experience? Is this an experience where I feel valued, in my identity of who and in who it is that I am and how I represent myself? And I think sometimes asking those questions and really evaluating programs for that are really important. And then also just the general support. My mom was a single parent. And so, my mom did not drop me off and pick me up every day from these programs. A lot of times I'd have to catch the bus. I'd have to ask for a ride, what have you. And so it was really important for her to make sure that when we had presentations or projects, that she was present. So, being involved in a way that's not like helicopter, that also values hey, well, what is it that you're learning? Where do you feel stuck? Is there a way that maybe we can work with another student, or maybe we can organize I don't want to say a play date when, maybe you have a tween or a teen, but, how do you also support them in helping to understand? And I think that, when you're a teenager, you're really fighting for this sense of independence and being able to make your own choices. And I think that the example of my mom helping me to think through those mental models of, well, what is it that you hope to gain? If this isn't something you want to do, what is your alternative? And just helping to think through what are the other options? Because that's the kind of frame of thinking you're going to need as an adult, right? And as you go off maybe to college, what is your decision-making process based on this? And so I think, obviously you don't want to force kids to do things they don't want to do, but I always advise, get to the underlying issue. What makes them uncomfortable in this space? Do they not feel like they're good? How do you help them to establish some grit and say, okay, yeah, maybe this thing right here on this side isn't, this isn't your forte, but maybe let's try to work through this and see what this is. But I'll honestly just say I have friends that, quit a lot of things, and today in their adulthood, they don't have anything that they can draw from that makes them stand out because they didn't develop that skill set and that tenacity. And it doesn't matter if you are the best or you're kind of mediocre at what it is, that skill you developed. You can always say, this was the experience I have. This is the knowledge that I gained. And this is what kind of helped me to understand how my interests extended into other areas of learning or knowledge. And so I think that, getting kids to be lifelong learners and at least be committed to things, even if they're not the greatest, I think there's just more thinking patterns that we can kind of help develop and construct. And then if they decide, ultimately, this isn't my thing, I'm super, super interested in X instead, then go full force and say, okay, well, perfect. Well, let's figure out what that journey is going to look like. But yeah, again, and I hope, one day when I have kids, I can kind of come back to the table with the same frame of mind as well.
Well, I love that. And I love how ambitious and driven and just how creative, you mentioned the dancing, you had both spectrums going on. You're very much in the arts and dancing and loving that part of it. And then your mom was encouraging you on the tech side, and you're getting the math and the sciences and the coding side. And you kind of have those two different worlds because they're very much split.
They were very split because it's I recall going back in high school and thinking of I had a spectrum of friends. I was also class president my junior and senior year. And it was
wow.
AP, calculus and AP bio. And it's those friends were very different than my other friends. And, and so it was a very interesting world where, I remember in dance, one day we were working on a very big production. And I recall one of the master teachers that had been flown in from New York who distinctly said, and here I am, it was the summertime. So I just got off the bus. I still had my Microsoft badge on me. And I remember us going through a routine, and she's like, if you're not committed to the artistry, just go work on computers. And I remember it being such a devastating thing because it made me feel less than. And, again, computers were associated with geekiness and nerdiness, and you couldn't be an artist. And I'm so glad that definition has evolved because today you can be, technical and an artist. And I had cousins who were highly creative, and they were also mathematicians, and they were software developers. And so they kind of led the way in teaching me that these spaces can collide. In fact, they enhance each other. And so, when I think about what my academic pursuits ended up being and going to FIT and also having a strong theater background, I think about how it helped me to develop confidence, like in terms of public speaking. It helped me to think very creatively about the way that I approached my work, even just down to my schoolwork and the way that I just kind of thought outside of like a spectrum, because it was like, yeah, I'm nerdy, but I'm also like, very engaging, and I approach my work in a very different kind of way. And so I think that kind of labeling and being put into the box was just never my shtick. And I kind of had to continue to fight for that level of independence and pave my own way. And so it was interesting to kind of go home and like everyone's asking you to fix their computers or something goes wrong, like you're automatically the resident expert, because you work for Microsoft. And then kind of going into a space where you are trying to develop as an artist, but also know, like, I always saw the angles of, well, what is the value of a production from a business perspective? How does this actually get handled? And so I saw myself also looking at how there was a disconnect for the artists that I was working with from having a business acumen. And so I saw that there was not just the disconnect, but then also I think kind of this sense of, you're either fully an artist or you're doing something else. And so now that we kind of value this idea of collaborative and intersectional teamwork, and making and pulling everything together, I didn't have that really growing up. And so now as I see it all kind of collide over the last decade, and the idea of the artist as technologist, it really is such a great, it's such a great new evolution that I think has expanded us as human beings and our concept of what does creativity actually look like. So that was just my experience. And so floating between the two worlds, I'm very grateful that I was able to have both.
Yeah.
I was able to have all sorts of community, because it's really what fueled my appreciation for the work that I do now, what I've been able to create, even creating like the Uber mentor campaign, at Uber, and being able to sign on like theater arts programs and symphonies to some of our campaigns. And I remember my general manager at the time saying like, yeah, so I've been here for like the last year and we never thought to ask like the theaters, to do a promo with us. And I'm like, well, why not? I mean, when Broadway shows come, like everyone is, going to the theater, like the symphony, the Nutcracker, you're doing that annually, even just as like a family tradition. So why wouldn't you not want to have people, doing rideshare to these things and like making it a full experience? And so it was interesting to kind of see how my background and my life showed up in my work in a way that was of value.
I love that. It's just, I love just hearing these different stories and just seeing how you have always been innovative. Like no matter what space you were in, you were thinking of what else can I do? You mentioned the Uber mentor campaign, which I want to get into. Before I talk to you about that, I want to ask you, take you back down to Microsoft, because you have this internship opportunity and you're so young.
Yeah.
And I know I would be scared out of my mind to do something like this. Take me back to that place. How are you feeling about going to Microsoft and working there?
Oh gosh, it was still very nervous, because you are young, you don't know what to say. You're working a 40-hour work week for the first time. Like my work up until that point in high school was teaching dance on the weekends or like working in my aunt's hair salon. And so my work environment was vastly different than like sitting at a desk and attending meetings and things like that. And so the great thing is that because Microsoft had a full dedicated internship program manager, the onboarding process was definitely fit for teenagers who, for some of us, like this was our very first like corporate work experience. And so a lot of it was kind of, I would kind of liken to like the college orientation experience for those that, had that experience, where they kind of walk you through some of the rules, things to do, how to treat your equipment, giving you a lay of the campus, giving you a sense of like the corporate values. There was definitely lots of luncheons, and there was a lot of instruction, even from the Technology Access Foundation prior to, where they did bring in executives to teach us about interviewing techniques, what to wear. And so, we're learning that at 14 years old, like that was so fascinating. I think I still wore sneakers to work because it was also like, Seattle. So
Yeah.
like everyone at Microsoft at the time was like wearing these like faded t-shirts and khaki shorts and working socks. And so a lot of the things were like, oh, I don't have to go like wear a suit, right? And so that was very fortuitous. And of course, I think that the teams were very gracious with us. And so my first experience, I got to work on the MSN Home and Auto channel when that was an actual thing. And, a lot of times, of course, they handed over some busy work, but there were some times I got to help create like sweepstakes promotions and things like that. But most of it was also about the learning experience. It was learning how to attend a meeting, take notes, things like that, and really find out what you're looking for. Not every single team that I participated on, I was completely enthusiastic about. There was a lot of autonomy. Again, like I got my own desk. One of the things that my other like co-interns and I did. So Microsoft has these shuttles because it's like Microsoft land, right? And so from building to building, you hop on a shuttle. And we used to like just like ride the shuttles to random places, and there's like free soda and things like that. So we would just like go and stock up and go to like company store and buy Xbox games for like $20 because they were really
that'd be a dream as a kid.
Yeah. Oh my God. It was fun. So, I mean, we had a lot of fun and just year after year, I think the second year I was working for a labs team. And so, so that was like, I had entered in my systems network administration class. And so I really, really enjoyed that. And I think there was one time my boss was out of town and one of the servers went down. And it's like, that heart of panic where like, you're like, I know how to do this, but right now I don't even remember my own name. And so I'm like calling my instructor at TAF, like, okay, can you walk me through this? My brain has gone blank. And we're like getting it back online, while, my boss is like remote. And so, so that was like, oh my God, I think I might've broken Microsoft because tired, and it was fine, of course, but of course you're like 15 and you're like, oh my gosh, this is going to ruin everything. And like none of the other developers are going to be able to do their work. And so it all falls on me. And it's like, why would they put this responsibility on me? And so, and I think the following year I worked for like an internal software team and got to create like animated GIFs at the most part, which are like really popular now. But yeah, I got to make those like back in the day to like help teach new products to internal teams. And so I got to work with a co-intern on that. And then my last year, I got to work on the diversity and inclusion team. And so it was really great because I actually got to lead a lot of initiatives to acclimate new interns into the Microsoft environment. And I just really enjoyed that because it really got me to kind of use all my 5 senses. I got to introduce interns to like the Microsoft home. So they always had a model smart home before it was a big deal. Wow. There's already both voice activation technology. And so I loved giving tours of that. And it kind of like allowed me to be like the ambassador for the Microsoft internship program. And then also start to have this conversation around diversity and inclusion, which for me was a completely new concept, right? And that I had not known that a company was actually, focused on, what was the experience like for individuals who identify, very differently than maybe the traditional or the majority. And so all of that, I think, coupled together, just really, really helped to shape, that like your approach to your work, can be very defined and unique. And there's not necessarily one right way to do things, but I had the freedom to kind of bring my own. I would say this, especially like with some of the corporate clients and people I've worked with, like I just put my own sauce on things, and that's kind of how I figure things out. But more important is I always have such a great team around me that if I can't figure it out by myself, I also know that I can kind of go to another team member and help to leverage their skills. And so, that has just kind of been the experience. And definitely just, I work to my strengths for sure.
I love how you got involved in the diversity and inclusion movement at Microsoft, because this is back in the day. I feel like D&I is like a popular thing, right? Yeah. That's touted by companies as like a marketing tactic. And I think it's cool that you back then got involved in diversity and inclusion. How was that experience for you?
Yeah, I mean, you're young. I will say, I kind of grew up in a bubble being from Seattle, being part of very, very diverse communities. And so I think for me, it just seemed very natural that we were focusing on ensuring that, employees down to their kids, down to the interns, felt like they were represented in some kind of capacity, be that at company picnics or, at family, like bring your kids to work day, or, at the time when we had Sonics, when the Sonics were like a thing.
Oh yeah.
We would organize entire trips, with Microsoft employees to attend. And so I think that it fostered a sense of community and kind of a communities that I grew up in, and I had the great fortune of just always feeling included. And so I think that it was such a great ground because I never felt isolated in who it is that I am at all. I got to work with a bevy of different kinds of people. And so it wasn't really until my adulthood where I realized not everyone was having that same kind of experience, and those values weren't necessarily practiced across the board. And so I'm glad now that there is conversation, but I think that action and data, at the end of the day, really determines and showcases like what true, company and corporate values are. And I think that, like I said, I kind of got to live in a bubble. I had some privileges. I got to be introduced into environments, based on the reputation of, organizations and the people that ran them. And so for me, that was such a great privilege to be able to walk into spaces and sort of they already were set for me and were expecting me versus kind of fighting to get in and to be recognized and to be valued. I think that's a very different, kind of experience. And so when I started to have that experience in some of the environments that I got to take space in, it was very foreign. I was very confused. I was very confused. I was very thrown off, and I did not realize that this was a thing. And I remember having a conversation, with some friends. We were like, "Why didn't our mothers tell us this?" Even though the world had changed drastically, there were still some things that, as millennials, we, a lot of folks, of course, say what you say about millennials and the entitlement generation, but we did grow up entitled. We did grow up, believing that we were equals, right? We were all equals. We all have equal skills. And that if we work hard, if we, get the right credentials and we prove ourselves, that we should be treated fairly. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So to walk into work environments sometimes where there wasn't a ton of respect, it was very jarring because we're like, wait, you guys have been enduring this for how long? For survival? And then you're like, well, I have the internet and I can go make money by myself and not be subject to this foolishness. And so, I just think that there's some optionality that comes with time and the advancing of technology. And so I think people opting out, but then also raising their voices to say, hey, like enough is enough. This is no longer okay. The world is changing drastically. We are a global environment. And if you want the best talent, like you're going to have to shape up in some areas so that you can keep us. I think it's a natural evolution of our existence as humans and getting better and smarter and more collaborative. And so yeah, I don't know if I answered the question.
I know. I love that because so often diversity inclusion is treated more as a marketing tactic. I feel like every company, even if they're well-meaning, will have diversity inclusion somewhere in the about section. But it comes down to, like, to your point about, does the data, is it actually there?
And even from a qualitative perspective, because I think that, there's a lot of showboating, on what that looks like. But I think that if you start to actually talk to employees about their lived experiences with inside companies, you'd hear a very different kind of story. And so I think that we have a long way to go, because just because you have hired more folks who identify with whatever affinity group that they identify, it does not mean that their experience is great. Right. I'm also a Twitter scroller. And so I'm reading comments every day of folks saying like, hey, I work remote because I cannot stand to go into an office where I'm the only person that looks like me in the space and I'm constantly berated or just, not included in the actual makeup of this company and the company culture, or I have to tuck myself in to make other people feel comfortable. And you have to think about the anxiety that comes along with showing up in workspaces where that you're not fully recognized, you're not fully included, and all you want to do is do great work and do work with smart people, but you have to consciously be aware of yourself and not really be able to just immerse yourself in the work and to showcase your own level of brilliance. Or, you know, if you have a direct conversation with someone, you're seen as being aggressive versus like, hey, no, actually, this isn't okay, and we have to address this. You know, just all of these kind of microaggressions that do take place with people of, you know, all kinds of backgrounds. And so the fact that we have the ability to opt out, it really changes the nature of our work. I think it changes the way that we participate in civil society. And I think it's a great alternative. Escapism is a great alternative to people who do face anxiety and, you know, have panic attacks on the job because of the pressures of just showing up as you are, showing up in your sexuality. And so I think that there's a long way to go to understand the psychology of what discrimination actually looks like. And I think that the conversations are open. I'm just not sure if they're kind of being shouted into an echo chamber, or if the people that really need to hear them and really need to make modifications in the way that, you know, the workforce happens for people, if they're also participating or listening in. Because I think, you know, we have diversity training, we have the workshops, we have all these things. But again, you know, we're not always making or accommodating, you know, to people who, you know, are far different from us. And so I'm actually sort of concerned about what the workforce of tomorrow looks like. I think having the optionality to work remote is great. It's great for especially people with families, or maybe you're caring for loved ones. You need the flexibility just in general. I think it's great for that, but I also think that we also learn from each other in real time. And so, you know, it kind of removes and strips away that opportunity for advanced learning about each other, because we won't be sharing and occupying the exact same spaces. But I know right now people are just trying to protect themselves. And so it's going to be interesting to kind of see how all of these things play out, but more importantly, how companies are holding themselves accountable.
Are there any organizations or companies that you look at and say, like, I think they're doing it the right way? I think the way that they're approaching diversity and inclusion and trying to make sure that everyone feels welcome and involved and it's a team environment. Do you see anything like that out there right now?
You know, I'll be honest with you. One of the companies I've worked with the last couple of years has been Capital One, and obviously I don't work internally, but I do know that they have a variety of programs, everything from helping women in leadership, or those who are looking to get into leadership, to develop internal programming. I know that there's ongoing training and services and things like that, particularly for older women employees who want to stay within the tech space. And I also know that there's a lot of sort of outward acknowledgement of, you know, like Black employee networks and things like that. And so my history with Capital One has been pretty fortuitous to be able to see and speak with people who've worked there and have felt represented and recognized, and kind of hearing their stories about how they've felt included. I'm not saying, again, that, you know, there's not still work to be done, but I love the leadership stance that a lot of the executives have taken in terms of fostering more opportunities for women, as well as women of color within that workforce. And, you know, I kind of just, you know, cursory, you know, overview of what other companies are doing. But that was the one that I definitely have a direct experience with.
Yeah, I love efforts that are trying to elevate more women into leadership positions. And I want to talk to you about your Uber Mentor campaign, connecting female executives with millennials. How did you come up with this?
That's such a great question. I really don't remember. And it was, you know, Women's History Month. And I knew that I wanted to do something around entrepreneurship as well as career management and development. And I just said, you know, it would be really cool if you could sit with, you know, a female executive in a car ride for, you know, 10 or 15 minutes. And so my GMs gave me the go ahead and said, like, let's try it. And we had executives from Wells Fargo, and a couple of other like local banks, and some professors even, you know, at some of the local colleges who like agreed to it. I'm like, I didn't.
So cool.
I just reached out and was like, hey, would you be interested in like riding in a car with a stranger for like an hour? And they're like, yeah, let's do it. And so it was great because, you know, you never know who's going to actually, you know, use this thing. But in the app at the time, we were able to have a button that you could select the car specifically for a mentor. And so we had everyone in there coming in with their resumes. There were people who brought their business plans, and the advice was just absolutely incredible. And so I had left Uber like late 2015, and a former coworker of mine had reached out to me a couple months later, and he's like, I think you're going to be really excited about this because they're adopting Uber Mentor in like Boston and Chicago. And
how cool is that?
Yeah, it was very exhilarating to see that it picked up. And so, you know, it just was such a great opportunity. I think a lot of times, you know, your ascension in your career and your trajectory is really based on your network. And not all of us have deep networks. And so it was a great opportunity to bring and highlight also some powerful women executives in the city of Charlotte, where I was working at the time. It was just great to also highlight them as well. And, you know, for them to get some recognition that, hey, there are women in these fields at the top of their fields that are doing great work. And so it was also just an ode to them around like, you know, their expertise and being able to connect, you know, with someone that they can kind of, even if it's just a 10 or 15-minute conversation, they were able to distill some of that knowledge and information. And these were very busy women. And I know that they did not have a ton of time, but the fact that they said yes to that hour, it was like, oh, this is brilliant, you know, and they all just highly valued, like, we want to help raise the next generation, particularly around women leaders, and to not feel so intimidated in terms of getting to the top of their careers. And so I'm just glad that that carried through to some other cities.
I think that's super, super creative. And man, what an impact it would make for somebody to be able to sit in a car next to an executive, next to a leader, just to learn from them, ask questions. What a really cool, creative idea that makes a huge impact on people.
Yeah, absolutely. I do recall people saying like, I had brought my resume and they introduced me to someone and I got an interview, or I remember that advice and like, it really helped me think through how to structure my career. And so, you know, it just, it's great. It's great. You come up with something and you never really know exactly what the outcomes are going to be. But to be able to kind of hear that feedback, it was very exhilarating.
Yeah, I love examples like this because this speaks to innovation. And sometimes when we talk about innovation, we think about cool technology, new technology that comes out. But innovation is like what you created with Uber Mentor, right? It's like taking an existing thing and going, how can I use this opportunity to like help other people? And then thinking about, mentorship. And this is a crazy idea, but I wonder if a leader would actually be in a car to use as a networking opportunity. And the fact that you actually moved that forward and it worked is such a cool campaign that you came up with. And really excited that you actually launched it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I had a great team to work with. And the great thing that, I built up a confidence, particularly working in tech, by just asking questions and saying like, hey, is this something that we can try? And I think that that's why the tech and startup world is so appealing. Because especially for millennials, you don't have to wait year after year to rise the ranks or ask for permission to do work or to be creative and to bring something new and innovative. You can go from like Monday saying, here's my pitch, and Tuesday, okay, let's figure out how to get it done. Where are the digital assets? What's the launch date? What's the campaign plan going to be? And you're moving at lightning speed, but you're learning so much and you can advance very quickly. And you kind of quickly find out what your strengths are. And then you also just have a sense of agency. And so I think that's also why like millennials have gravitated more towards that tech and startup environment. I know that's why I decided to do that versus going in government. I had decided to kind of learn more about public policy. I was a fellow. I got a chance to work for a mayor out of Bridgeport. And I greatly enjoyed being in that community and understanding how government works. But I also had experiences where, there was like kind of reverse, I don't want to say reverse, but more of, age discrimination, on the sense of like, I was young, I was kind of walking in an environment where people felt like, oh, it took me so long to get to this stage. How do you get to get here without having paid your dues? And Wall Street Journal just pushed out a piece the other day on some of the challenges that millennials had faced in the workplace around that. And I do recall, someone having said like, I've been here longer than you've been alive, and, just very interesting environments environments where it's like, oh, like I'm not here to threaten your job or to take your job. If anything, I want to learn because I don't know these systems. I don't know the language or what have you.
Yes.
And so when I made the decision to leave the Northeast and move to the Southeast, it was really predicated on this idea of like, listen, I just want to do great work. I want to work with smart people. I want to work, in spaces that are, creating new pathways and opportunity for people. And so as much as it was like fun to work for these great startups, what was more important to me was what that impact could potentially look like. When I was able to come on as a contractor with Google Fiber, it was really like, hey, we're enabling high-speed internet access in public housing units and being able to work with the Department of Housing in order to ensure that families and communities had, technology at their fingertips to just access like however they wanted to use the internet, like not to regulate it for them on what they should be focused on, but more so of like, you should just have access to it because, internet really should be like a utility. Right. And so for me, the way that I've shaped my experience, and even as I've like gone in to launch ThePLUG and BLKTECH Charlotte and some of the other endeavors that I've participated in, it's always been about how do we ensure that we have the most representation a part of and attached to these technologies? How do we give people social capital as well as cultural capital in these spaces? And how do we enable like the next wave of innovators and big thinkers? Because this is how we kind of continue to advance, as a city, as a community, as a nation, what have you. And that's just the philosophy that has always driven me. And I had to really define that for myself and realize like that's space is probably only going to be in tech just because the thought process of how things can get done quickly is important. And I think now in the course of my work as a journalist and as a data journalist, part of my efforts are also spearheaded by this idea of, okay, great, we have the technology and that's awesome. Now, what is that impact? How is that, either affecting negatively or positively in communities that are traditionally marginalized? And so it's just a ton of like inquiry, right? And curiosity around, okay, we think this is good, but now who's not benefiting or who's being negatively impacted? And so I think that level of consciousness and awareness is something that we constantly have to strive for as we are talking about and leading innovation as well.
All these different projects that you work on, all these really creative endeavors, I'm curious about the things that motivate you because you're so passionate and I love seeing your drive. And I'm just curious about what keeps you going, especially when the failures happen.
Yeah, I mean, and failure is just a part of life. As we all know, if we've reached any kind of age of maturity, I think it's really staying true to the realization that I get to be here because there were so many people, that took the hits ahead of me. And so I think about that representation of my mom, my grandparents, especially as an African-American in this country, my grandparents didn't get a chance to vote until they were in their 30s, right? And so for me to squander away opportunity is, I think, a direct disrespect to their legacy. And so I know the kind of community I came from and how that community building was so significant in my life. As I mentioned, earlier in the conversation, I was raised by a single mom. So that meant that a lot of my mom's closest friends and allies and colleagues were heavily in my life as mentors, as, aunts and uncles and surrogate cousins and things like that. And so I got to take bits and parts of them, of their beliefs, of their kind of, work. And I got to really embed that in terms of my thinking of who I was becoming. And so community is always at the center of the things that I do and that I think about, and enabling opportunity for others and being able to highlight the work and the brilliance of others is really where I started to deviate from just working in technology and more so how do I help to lead a conversation that is much more inclusive? And that's really where the birthplace of ThePLUG kind of came from. I was looking at the storylines of, all these kind of white guy geniuses, right? And I worked for a company that was led by one, and I was, very grateful for that. But I also thought back to my cousins that attended historically Black colleges and universities as, software engineers and mathematicians, and were working in, some of the top companies or leading, leading plants as managers of GM or something like that. And I'm like, well, why aren't these voices in the conversation as well? Why aren't the stories that were being fed in America, particularly around innovation and who gets to put their hands on innovation, why aren't they inclusive? Because if I can create these things and not have, super, super hardcore technical skills, imagine what else is being created by people that, look like me or look like my friends or come from the environments that me and my friends came from. Where is that conversation taking place? And so I developed the plug. I had been writing sort of ancillary to my work at Uber, my work at, Google Fiber. I'd been writing for Fast Company. I'd been documenting trends of, hey, Black investors that made their money in government contracts and construction in the 80s and the 90s, like they're making investments in like these new startup founders. Like not only is that like culturally relative, it's just absolutely interesting, right? And the curiosity of, hey, these communities are growing. I did stories on, Charlotte's Nepali refugee community. And, starting to highlight like, well, what happens when you get asylum to the US and you're in your 60s and you don't speak the language and you have to, you have to figure out what your retirement plan looks like. And you're 100% dependent upon the young people in your community. Like, how do we ask smarter questions about like what's shaping our communities and like what innovations are taking place in order to solve some of the challenges that are taking place? And so that again eventually evolved into like the plug as a daily newsletter that maybe 10 of my friends read at the beginning, and then quickly sort of escalated as I started to look at how do I start to now report more rigorously on, communities and people, investors, what have you, that are shaping, what I defined as the Black innovation economy. And then sort of how do we power that with data? Right. And so, that's when I decided, let me kind of make a departure for a second and go to J school, because I also wanted to better my craft as a storyteller and as a journalist. But more important, there was a data component to the program that I participated in. And so as I was looking at, the work that I got to do at Uber, which was highly data driven and a lot of work with the data scientists, I was like, I want more of that. I just don't want take more of that in respect to like working in banking, which was kind of where all of the data programs were offered mostly. It was more around a banking context versus like, how do I apply this to my work on a day-to-day basis and the things that I want to do? So when I stumbled upon Columbia's data journalism program, I was like, yep, that's for me. That's exactly how I think. And it took me back to being 14 years old and being both an artist and a scientist at the same time. And so that program was like, perfect. It was like 40% computational. It was, developing R and Python, scripts and like mining through data. And then also having very kind of high level conversations with other students across New York City around how do we start to create new tools to inform people? How do we like develop new ideas around Alexa skills and work with the New York Times R&D department around like how do we start to deliver news and journalism products in a very different way to ensure that like the democracy we're chasing after truly is one that is technologically advanced. So big ideas, big thinking, a lot of skills in like a 10-month period, because it was like an accelerated master's program. Very insane. At the same time, running the plug and building up BLKTECH Charlotte. And so it was a lot, but it was definitely kind of the natural progression of my journey. And so I went in with the idea of what if I could develop more of a core solution around, what we're collecting on minority innovation communities, because we're starting to see people going back to your whole bit on, the diversity and inclusion conversation. Well, okay, great. Like all these things, all this activity is happening. And if you look at like 2013, 2012, like we're the birth of tech companies starting to release their internal employee data, we're starting to see drastic changes in money being allocated to different programs. But who's actually tracking what that looks like as an aggregate? What does that impact look like on cities? How does that influence policy decision makings? What kind of inclusivity programs exist? And then what are the actual outcomes? And then how do we measure that against the way and nature of folks of color starting and launching businesses, getting access to funding, hiring people, because we also know that, women minorities tend to hire more women and minorities, right, into these roles. How does all of this as an ecosystem and as an innovation economy take shape? And like, how do we start to use that data to start creating benchmarks for now what these innovation economies, these sort of niche-based innovation economies, how do they actually affect all of what's happening in innovation? I think those are big questions that we haven't really taken the opportunity to dive into. And so that was really the thesis that I went into my grad school program with, but also powers the plug today.
Oh my gosh. This could easily be a 4-hour podcast. So you're in this very intense, accelerated grad school program focused on
Ooh.
data journalism, and you're still writing for the plug. And at this point, you're starting up BLKTECH Charlotte. Is that right?
So BLKTECH Charlotte had launched just a few months prior.
Oh, wow.
I had some co-founders, and so I would leave, and we opened up a space. So we had actual 1,200 square foot space.
Oh, wow.
During my breaks, I would go to Charlotte, and I look back on that period of time, and I'm like, there was no sleep to be had. But yeah, I would go back to Charlotte for meetings, and I remember us getting the office space together in about 3 days. So it was like I touched down,
Wow.
met our designer at IKEA, and sent an email out to people to ask for assistance, because we didn't have like any real money. You know, this was all just like, let's just start creating programming for Black people in tech in Charlotte. And so we didn't really have a budget. And I was just like, listen, y'all have been riding with us for a couple of months now. Can you come help us put together furniture, and I'll buy pizza? And I literally bought pizza. And it was like, you know, January, like dead of winter. And so we were just in there with our like, you know, our coats and our hats, and just like screwing legs on, you know, and, you know, getting paint up on the walls, and, you know, cleaning bathrooms and taking out trash. And yeah, and like 3 days later, it was like grand opening, the mayor comes, blesses our space. And then it was like next day, Sherrell's back on a plane, back to class. And so it was a crazy, crazy time. But I'm also fortunate that my co-founders, Enovia Bedford and Lafrida Henley, were just such phenomenal, women who came from other corporate environments like Vitamin Water and NBC Universal, who really kind of held down the fort. So as we did our programming, I was kind of, tapping in remotely and then coming down when I could, especially on breaks. And also, building my thesis, and all of those themes were super integrated into my coursework. And so I was not doing things like in silos. It was all integrated. And so a lot of the data and a lot of the things that I was pulling was because I already had access to all of these deep networks, because it was all part of the activities that I had going on. But yeah, I don't recommend two businesses and attend an accelerated math. That you can tell I had no children. So, so yeah, it was intense for sure.
Why was having the space for BLKTECH Charlotte important to you?
So it was interesting because we had not really thought about space, but space was so significant, particularly in a city that had very few spaces that were either owned or operated by folks of color. Quite honestly, I remember getting calls from my co-founders, and they would say, like, people just come by here, like they just stand here in awe and they look at us. And at first they were like it's kind of creepy. But I remember like going to a meeting in the mayor's office, and there was a gentleman that worked in the mayor's office in City Hall, who had stopped us and just said, like, I've been telling my daughters about you all, and I'm just very proud of you. Like, my church is praying for you all. It's the South, so everybody's church is praying for you, and it was just very significant. And I remember people who were subscribed to the plug who, would get on the bus and come to the space and just say, like, wow, like, this is incredible, and you got across the generations. I think, the young people were inspired and were like, can we just work out of here for the day? And, we had the older folks who were just like, you felt that sense of pride. And I think it took me back to my grandparents and their struggle in this country, and their grandparents' struggle, and, and just having a monument of something that was unapologetically Black and for them, and invited them into, this is a space for innovation for you, and for you to feel like you can innovate in a safe space and not have to tuck yourself in.
Why Charlotte? Because you could have just called it BLKTECH and it could have been focused on that. Why was it important that you localized it to Charlotte?
It was super important and significant because, I had gone to Charlotte, had worked for Uber, had transitioned over to Google Fiber. And I was, again, like a techie at my core, always wanted to be learning and understand who else was like me, in this space. And so as I was attending the events and the conversations around technology, I was, usually the only woman in the room, or, the only woman of color in the room. And that really bothered me, because I thought to myself, here I am in a very diverse city where there's at least a almost 40% representation of folks of color, be that African American, Latinx, or, Asian, however you define that. And yeah, like these rooms are full of like white guys, and they're all kind of like applauding themselves for all the great work they're doing. And I'm like, what's going on? And I'm like, what? And so I remember there were a couple of key things that took shape in Charlotte. One was this study around the lack of economic mobility in the city and the community, despite having like all of these very large banks, right? That kind of were the pinnacles of employment, and kind of helping Black people get into the executive class. But there were also these folks who were kind of like on the other side of the tracks, who had never had access to those opportunities. And then there was also just some other like internal turmoil that was taking place in the city. And so I, being who I am and someone who was always very proactive about my life experience, I connected with my two co-founders and I said, listen, I don't want to be on the end of like, let's wait 10 years and see if they do something, but let's go chart a path for ourselves and like talk about how we want the future of the city to show up for us, because Charlotte is growing and, the city is attracting more talent. It's attracting more companies that are starting up or creating a second headquarters. How do we ensure that Black and brown people and voices and talent get embedded into that, particularly as the city starts to invest more in its entrepreneurship community? And so we really just looked at like, what should we call it? And was like, let's just call it Black Tech Charlotte. Like, so it's unequivocally, a message that says like, this is for you. And so we literally planned this event in 2 weeks. Again, no money on the table, just like two for $12 wines from like the local Publix, and a couple of favors from all of our backgrounds and connections. Like, hey, help us fill up some swag bags. And I think we got like some hors d'oeuvres or something like that. And within that week, when we were about to launch, we already had 125 people RSVP.
Wow.
And then we had like a waiting list, because the capacity for the space, we were able to actually host it at Google Fiber, but the capacity for the space, like we had to cut it off. And
wow.
we were like, oh, clearly we're onto something here, because we just thought 40 people would show up out of pity for us. And it was it was like, no. And so that's really where we said, let's do this again, and let's do this, and let's make it like the best South by Southwest meets Williamsburg rooftop, like really funky, really interactive, a learning experience that's also fun, is swaggy, has all the sauce. And so from there, we just kind of built things as we go, and we leveraged surveys and feedback, and we started collecting, information on who was building what. And I think that first event, we had everyone from students that were driving up from local colleges to private equity investors to entrepreneurs who were building things like in the suburbs, on their front porch or whatever. And then we had just technologists who were just like, I don't have this kind of representation at work, and I've been looking for a geeky community that I can be part of, that also speaks to my cultural values. And so we just kept building the plan as we went along, and at the same time, like, just started to collect that data. And then by the end of 2017, we had over 800 plus, people as part of our network and our database. And we started to ask, like, is Charlotte even tracking, what Black tech entrepreneurs are building, or what kind of Black tech talent exists? Because all the conversations are these very like poverty driven stories. And so you would think, looking on the outside in, that the only folks of color in the city are completely destitute, but that's just not the case. And so we wanted to help change and shift that narrative, and to help to drive opportunity and make connections. And we would bring down folks from like Slack and Impact America Fund and Comcast Catalyst Ventures, and we would host luncheons and like introduce entrepreneurs to investors. A lot of them for the first time. It was the first time ever meeting another Black person that was an investor at a major corporate company. And so for us, we weren't necessarily looking at outcomes of like, well, who can we, say, oh, they went on to raise $5 million. Our biggest thing was, how do we just start to create social capital in this group, and also put a spotlight on who's essentially like been deemed invisible in this city. And so I'm very proud of that work. It has definitely been very tiring and thankless, but at the same time, extremely rewarding. And it has also fueled a lot of the work that I've done, with the plug, in terms of like looking at Black majority cities and starting to cultivate, like, listen, what is taking place and taking shape, and how can we start to tell different kinds of stories and provide insights on what's taking shape in these particular communities.
Before we go, one of the constant themes has been around diversity and inclusion, supporting minorities in tech. And I was wondering, I'll add two final questions for you. The first one is for the leaders at companies listening in. They could be managers, or they manage a small team. They want to be more inclusive. Advice to them to help them improve their own attitudes, and also making sure that everyone that they're working with feels included and feels loved and cared for. So advice for them. And then the second would be just for the person like me, the average employee, who's just, hey, I have a part to play too. Mm-hmm. And how can I help improve the culture of my company?
Yeah. I think those are important questions to like constantly ask. I don't think there's a one size fits all. I think at the end of the day, like, treat people like human beings, right? I think that sometimes there can be power plays and power struggles. And I think that if you know that you're in a position of power and you are sort of actively discriminating against someone, like, you need to have a personal check-in, right? I think it really comes down to just general, like, be an adult, treat people with respect and regard, everyone from the taking out the trash to the person that's sitting across the table from you writing your paycheck. I think it really is a human question on how we treat people in general. And if you're not a great person, like that's something that no training program can. It really is about like self-reflection on how you show up in the world. And from a programming standpoint, I think that, it's being okay with uncomfortable conversations, ensuring that you are looking at and tapping talent and really seeing people, because a lot of times the same voices will kind of always be heard. And I think that if you also kind of go to people and just say, like, what should I do? What should I do? It sometimes can almost be discriminatory in and of itself, because it's like, I can't solve all the problems for the entire race at this company. There's so many other people to involve in this decision-making process around what kind of programming we may need or what the needs are. And so I think that, again, like, that data collection component is super significant. If there's reviews that you're giving to employees, how do you give reviews? How do your employees give reviews for their experience? What kind of survey are you designing, on an anonymous level, so that people will feel comfortable with participating, where you can like learn about like, how are people experiencing, the culture of your company? Do they feel heard? Do they feel that it's a safe space for women, minorities, people who identify as LGBTQI plus? Are you getting that feedback on a regular basis? And then once you do receive that feedback, are you actively and passionately saying, okay, clearly there's some challenges here. Let's go about, figuring out how to work towards solving them. And then, identifying, some people who want to take on a leadership role in terms of helping to create programming or conversations that can be had or training that can be had, internally. I think there's so many different levels, and it definitely is a process. It's not a one size fits all, but it's definitely a process. I think secondarily, what was the second question?
Oh, it was not just for leaders, but just for, it starts with the people, right? How are we all being more inclusive and more caring towards everybody that we're working with?
And I think, again, kind of going back to this, like, how can you be better? How can you do human better, right? So I know that, some of the challenges I've always had with working on, all male teams has just been being talked over or my work being questioned or what have you. And I think that, when other men in the room can step up and say, hey, like, Sherrell's idea wasn't completed, or referring to someone else's work and saying, hey, this person did a great job on this. I think we should really consider like what their thoughts or something. Like, it's that sponsorship and passing the mic. It is saying like, hey, when you're presented with an opportunity and something that you don't necessarily need, Is there someone else within your network, within your immediate network, a coworker that you really admire their work, that often does not get that recognition? Can you pass it off and say, hey, you know what? Thanks for this, but I think such and such will be, a better fit. You should really talk to them, and here's why. And I think that those are kind of very simple ways to kind of pass the baton and just say, like, let me recognize someone that hasn't been recognized, and not see it as like a charity, right? Like, and also don't go around with this like complex of savior where, oh, look how great I am. I'm so, passionate about like being an ally to women and minorities. I think it's also, being able to be in those spaces, when hard conversations are being had, and just kind of being quiet as well. And then also talking to some of your other male colleagues, or checking behavior and just saying, hey, like, I think that was a little insensitive. Again, like, I think especially when it comes to families, right? I think when people who have families, it can be a challenge to like maybe have to leave work because your kid is sick and you have to pick them up, but being sensitive to the fact that like life happens, and don't make people feel further ostracized because of their responsibilities. So how do you ensure that like it's a safe space even for someone to talk to you about like, hey, this is what's going on at home, or what have you, or I have to leave, can you cover for me, or what have you. Like, it can be frustrating, especially if in the middle of a project, but the reality is like, we're not saving lives here, right? So
that's right. Thank you. Yep, that's right.
How do you give people a little bit more grace, and maybe you just say like, hey, I'll send you an update after the meeting, just so you're kind of in the loop, or what have you. I'll send you my notes from the meeting. And again, like, I know every workplace is different. I know every relationship is different. You don't always have to like or be best friends with your colleagues. And so there is some boundaries and barriers that you put between your personal life and your work life. But I think just in general, like hearing people, seeing people, acknowledging people, I think those things are kind of great places to start. But definitely finding ways where you can, where that if you have the upper hand or the advantage, based on whatever it is, that you're also helping to point in other directions to give people opportunity. And it might even just be like, hey, there's a new team member that just joined, and like, how do you help them further acclimate? Or like, hey, you want to grab coffee? Or, hey, like, I'm about to work on this thing. It might be a great learning opportunity for you. Are you interested? In participating? It might just be a great way to like bond and connect. I remember I had some coworkers who invited me to go golfing. I don't golf. I don't do the sports. And like, I ended up not going just because I had other plans, but I felt great about being invited. So I think to, also just standing up for people, again, in a respectful way, in a very much professional way as well, where like, hey, and sometimes it may have to be a side conversation. But I think that, if we all kind of do a little bit of our part, perhaps it makes a difference for someone else's experience. And, again, like, the workforce is about working with other people with different kinds of personalities. Some of us have off days. Some of us, may have had a death, a parent that died. A lot of us deal with various like, mental anxieties or what have you. I think it's about giving people grace. And I think also just being much more aware, paying attention to the room, seeing how power dynamics are working when you're in that conference room, who's being, spoken to as like a contributor, and then kind of who's being spoken to as though like you should just be lucky to be here. Those are very different kinds of tonalities. And we feel them, even if you can't always identify them. I think it's called like the unknown thought, or the unthought known, or something like that. It's kind of like all that hidden subtext interactions. It's like being wary of those things and being aware and finding out ways to how to like divert some of that. Again, it's not your responsibility alone, but it definitely is our responsibility to step in where we can identify that's taking place.
It's solid advice. And you're totally right about the nonverbal cues, the nonverbal things that are happening within the meeting room that can belittle somebody, make somebody feel bad, not feel valued. People have to be very, very careful with their nonverbal behavior. And I love that you started everything. You shared all these great tactics and things we can all do to build a more inclusive place. But I love how you started off with saying like that question around how am I caring for others? That's a question we need to constantly be asking ourselves. I love that you started it with that, because that's so true. Like every day, every week, we should be asking ourselves, what am I doing to make my workplace better? How am I caring for those around me? What am I doing verbally, non-verbally, and just being self-aware and having those check-ins?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I love that. Well, Sherrell, thank you so much for being on Data Talk, and thank you for all the advice you shared. And I loved learning about your background, all the amazing things you're doing, the plug, BLKTECH Charlotte. For those that want to follow you, want to connect with you, what are the best ways for them to do that?
I am all over the internet. You can do just Sherrell_Dorsey. And also tpinsights.com is where to find my publication, my work, and get access to our daily and weekly briefings on the Black innovation economy. It's a great way to just kind of stay in the loop and see who's doing what.
Great. And we will we'll be developing a blog post featuring Sherrell, and we'll have links to her LinkedIn profile, her Twitter bio, other things that she's written, the plug, BLKTECH Charlotte. If you'd like to get all those links, they'll be in the Experian blog, and the short URL will be ex.pn/Sherrell, spelled SHERRELL. Thank you, Sherrell.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Data Talk with Sherrell Dorsey. I had a blast getting to know her. I hope to have her back on the show. For those new to Data Talk, we share out episodes every single week, and you can find a full catalog of previous shows, including the YouTube videos on our Experian News blog. To find them, you can just do a Google search for Data Talk, or you can go to experian.com/Data Talk. Oh, and by the way, we love hearing from our community. So if you have suggestions for topics for us to cover or guests you'd like to hear on the show, please reach out. You can always reach me on Twitter at Experian Data Lab, or you can email me directly. My email is simply michael.delgado@experian.com. You can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. Take care and hope you have a wonderful week.